Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. I guess a dreary day makes for a good webinar day, so thanks for tuning in. For those that don't know me, my name is Aaron Lefland, and I am the Deputy Director at the Connecticut Land Conservation Council. CLCC, as many of you know us, we are the umbrella organization for Connecticut's land trusts, and we support your land trust's work through policy, advocacy, funding, technical assistance, capacity building, and other programs like this one. Today's presentation is part of our expanded webinar series that we're kicking off, which complements the other ways that CLCC helps land trusts grow stronger and carry out their missions more effectively. If you don't already, I encourage you to subscribe to our e-news, which is a great way to stay apprised of upcoming programs, such as our four-part fundraising webinar series that will be kicking off next month. Today's topic is a special one, and one that's especially of interest to me, having worked at a land trust with the Firefly Sanctuary down in New Canaan. Today, we're going to be diving into the fascinating world of fireflies. We'll explore their biology and ecology and learn about the threats that they're facing and discuss how land trusts can play a role in protecting these iconic species. Before we start, just a few quick housekeeping notes. First, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We've saved plenty of time at the end, and we'll get through those at the end of Candace's presentation. As I mentioned, to help preserve some of the bandwidth, we ask that you mute and keep your video off until we get to the Q&A session. And just a reminder that we are recording, and we will be sharing both the recording and the slides and a couple of other resources that Candace has for us within the next few days. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce today's speaker, Candace Fallon. Candace is a senior conservation biologist at the Xerces Society. She works with researchers, land managers, and community scientists to study and protect at-risk invertebrates and their habitats. Her work includes everything from species inventories and monitoring to community science and outreach. As the Firefly lead at Xerces, Candace manages their Firefly conservation programs and also serves as the co-chair of the North American section of the International Union for Conservation in Nature and their Firefly Specialist Group. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Candace.
Thanks, Erin. Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my presentation. So just bear with me for a moment. All right. That look good to everyone?
Yep, looks good on our end.
Great. Okay, yeah, so hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks as well to Erin for making this happen. Like Erin said, my name is Candace. I'm a biologist at the Xerces Society, and I lead our Firefly Conservation Program. So I'm going to talk to you all about fireflies today. In case you're not familiar with Xerces, we are a science-based nonprofit, and we focus on the protection of nature through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. We have 5 main programs at Xerces, and these focus on endangered species, protection of pollinators.
It took a little longer to.
Sorry, that should be muted.
Okay. We have 5 main programs at Xerces. So endangered species, which is the program that I'm based in. We also have protection of pollinators in agricultural landscapes. We have a pesticide reduction team, community engagement, and conservation policy. And so the butterfly that you see pictured here is the Xerces blue. And this was the first insect known to go extinct in the US due to human causes. And so it's both our namesake and also a reminder for why we do the work that we do. Xerces is supported by a really amazing community of members, and this is what makes a lot of our work possible. So if any of you are members who are joining today, I just want to say thank you. And if you'd like to become a member, you can do so on our website. So my talk today is going to focus on the idea of firefly sanctuaries and how you might go about establishing one or thinking about establishing one. But before I get into all of that, I really just want to provide some background on firefly life history and why sanctuaries are even needed for fireflies. So first up, really basic, what are fireflies? Fireflies are a type of beetle. So similar to things like ladybugs or scarab beetles, they have these front wings that are modified to protect their lower hind wings. And so in these two images, you can see that the front wings are actually hardened, while the hind wings are actually quite delicate looking. And so when they're at rest, like this picture on the left, the hardened front wings actually cover the hind wings. And then when the firefly is in flight, they pull back those hardened wings, and then the more fragile wings underneath are what they use to fly. So what distinguishes fireflies from other beetles? Your first thought might be that it's the fact that they light up, but that's actually not a super reliable trait. Unlike a lot of other beetles, fireflies belong to a group with pretty soft bodies, so that's one clue that you're looking at a firefly. But another good way of distinguishing fireflies is to actually look at the head. And so you can see here I have an arrow pointing to the head shield, or also known as the pronotum. And in fireflies, this head shield is really broad and it typically hides the head. So if you're looking at it from above, like this picture on the left, you can't see the animal's head. It's covered by this head shield, even though the eyes might poke out from below. And this is usually a pretty good clue that you're looking at a firefly. You might be surprised to learn that not all fireflies flash. So here in the US, we actually have three different categories of fireflies. The flashing fireflies, also known as lightning bugs, we have glowworms, and we have daytime dark fireflies. And so the flashing fireflies are obviously the most well known. It's the ones that we all think about and love, and kids go out and catch at night. Um, but there are quite a few species of the other two groups. So glowworms are known for their flightless glowing females. And this image of a hot pink kind of grub worm-like creature in the center here, that's actually an adult female glowworm. They don't have wings, or if they do, they're really reduced and they can't actually be used for flight. Whereas the adult males of glowworms look like what you would think of as a typical firefly. And then the daytime dark species are actually active during the day. And so they don't use light as adults. We think that the majority of these species, if not all of them, actually use pheromones to communicate with potential mates. So adults who do use bioluminescence, they are using this as a form of communication in courtship. So males flash a specific pattern and then wait for a response flash from a female. Um, there are larvae that also use light as a deterrent to would-be predators. So light can actually be found all throughout the life stages, but not necessarily in the adult life stage. Like butterflies, fireflies go through four distinct life stages. So they start out as these like really tiny eggs laid in damp places, maybe a mossy log or some damp soil. And then after a couple of weeks, the egg will hatch into a larva. And this larva's mission is pretty straightforward. It just needs to eat a bunch and grow and not dry out and not get eaten by something else. And for most firefly species, this takes up the bulk of their life. The larval life stage can actually last up to 2 years in some species. It's a really long phase. Once these larvae have grown big enough and the weather is right, they'll then turn into a pupa, often it's somewhere in the soil, and then it'll take a few more weeks to become an adult. And once those adults emerge, they just have one central goal, and that is to mate and make more fireflies. And with a few exceptions, this adult phase is really short and sweet. It tends to last less than a month. And it's really interesting that we think of fireflies in this adult lit up phase when it's really such a small part of the overall life cycle. So if someone asked me, what does a firefly look like? This might actually be the most truthful response. All of these images here, which depict the larval life stage of a firefly. Um, when I first saw images of firefly larvae and then saw them out in the wild, I was amazed. They did not look anything like what I expected a firefly larva to look like. And this is really a life stage that we should be giving a lot more attention to. So these are very strange looking creatures. They have these armored, segmented, kind of flattened bodies. Sometimes people confuse them with millipedes or even like a flattened version of a roly-poly. But they're really, really neat. And these are just kind of like eating machines. They're out there, they're hunting on the soil surface and in the leaf litter. looking for prey. Most of us probably didn't grow up thinking of fireflies as predators, but that's actually their main place in the food chain. So some of the classic firefly foods are things like snails, slugs, and worms. They've also been seen scavenging on dead insects and even some berries. But as you can see, they can take down other creatures much larger than themselves. And this is because they have these sharp mandibles that they use to pierce their prey, and then they actually inject this like paralyzing toxin into them before eating them. It's a little bit gnarly. So I mentioned a little while ago that firefly larvae sometimes use light as a warning signal. And, people ask us sometimes, are fireflies good food sources for other animals, especially things like birds? And the answer is probably not. So you can see in this picture on the left, there's a sparrow here that caught a winter firefly. And maybe this just was a bird that didn't know yet, hadn't been taught a lesson yet by fireflies. But as you can see on the right in this picture, when fireflies are disturbed, they'll actually start bleeding or emitting out this milky white substance that's very bitter and very toxic. And so fireflies actually contain chemicals that are similar to the compounds found in things like toads or milkweeds or even monarch butterflies. And this makes them really distasteful. So there's a high likelihood that this bird on the left, this may have been its last firefly meal. Fireflies do have some predators, but the majority of them seem to be other arthropods, typically things like spiders and assassin bugs. Sometimes when I'm doing surveys, I get really excited because I see an unusual flash in the distance. And then when I get up closer, I realize it's actually a distress call from a firefly that's been caught in a spider web. So sometimes you can actually find fireflies that you're looking for just by looking at webs. Another question that we get quite a bit is, are fireflies pollinators? And the answer to this is probably not, but maybe sometimes. So fireflies do visit flowers. You can see here, all of these are fireflies visiting different blooms. Many species do seem to like milkweed nectar, and you can see that in the picture on the far left here. This is a Big Dipper firefly. But that said, we don't really know of any plants that rely on fireflies for pollination. So it's likely that as fireflies are kind of moving through the landscape and maybe, sipping on some nectar here and there, that they might be moving pollen from flower to flower or plant to plant, but they're not really what we would think of as kind of, your typical pollinators, maybe accidental pollinators. So another thing that might surprise you is that fireflies are really widespread across the country. We have 177 species currently described from the US and Canada. And so, as you can see from the black dots on this map, fireflies can be found in every state except for Hawaii. And I realize that there aren't any dots in Alaska right now, but that is just outdated, and there are a bunch up there as well. And they're also found in every Canadian province except for one. So they're also found in a really wide variety of habitats. You can see them in riparian woodlands, desert canyons, wet meadows, sometimes even agricultural fields, people's yards. So here are some photos just depicting some places that we've seen fireflies in our surveys. The one thing that really seems to be kind of the constant across these habitats is some form of moisture. Remember, as I said earlier, fireflies tend to have really soft bodies, and so they can desiccate and dry out really easily. And so moisture is critically important for them. So now that I gave you kind of this quick overview of firefly ecology and natural history, I just want to touch a little bit on their conservation status in the US. So our Firefly Conservation Program at Xerces began in 2018, and this was largely in response to anecdote after anecdote of fireflies becoming more scarce or disappearing altogether from some places. And so we just started seeing, more of these headlines as well. Fireflies in decline. nature's nightlights in danger? Are the summer light shows disappearing? Dimming prospects face some fireflies. And this was coupled with people also reaching out to Xerces and just saying, hey, I see way fewer fireflies than I did in the past. Or, I used to catch them as a kid and now they're not there anymore. And so stories like this always really pique our interest at Xerces, and we decided to look a little bit more into it. Something that you might notice about these headlines is that they really treat fireflies as kind of this monolith, right? Like fireflies in general are in trouble. It's kind of like saying butterflies in general are in trouble. And while both of those things may be true, it doesn't really get to the heart of what's happening at the species level. In 2020, the IUCN Firefly Specialist Group released red list assessments for over 130 species in the US and Canada. So a good portion of the 177 that have been described. And if you're not familiar with the IUCN Red List, this is really an international, like standardized framework for assessing extinction risk of species. And so as you go through the assessment process of each species, there's a spectrum of categories that you can assign. And this ranges from anywhere, from extinct to several different threatened categories, all the way to least concern or data deficient if we don't have enough information. And it's important to note here too that the red list categories it's a non-regulatory entity. It doesn't have any legal status. And so this is totally separate from like the federal endangered species list or state level threatened and endangered species lists. So even some of some of the technology or the terminology is the same, like they use endangered, it doesn't have any legal status. And in some ways, you can think of the red listing process as kind of this conservation prioritization process. So we're really identifying the species that are most at risk of extinction, and then that kind of lays the foundation for where we go next. And so we worked on these red list assessments for probably 2 years, working really closely with the specialist group and the New Mexico Biopark Society. And what we found was that a significant portion of fireflies, potentially up to a third of species, might be threatened with extinction. So like in any taxonomic group, there are some species that are a lot more adaptable and widespread. And so here you can see that there were 32% that were categorized as least concern. The population seems stable. They're what we might consider the more common firefly species. And so at the moment, we aren't too worried about those ones. Unfortunately, over half of the species we assessed lacked any amount of data that we could actually, do a full conservation status assessment. So over, yeah, 53% of species. And then, for some of these, it was just the fact that nobody has really been studying them, potentially even since they've been described. And then, others, like no one's even reported seeing them in the last 50 years or more. So it's definitely a lot of work that needs to be done for some of these species. And then you'll see here too, we had 18 that were categorized as threatened, and then another 2 that were near threatened. And so through this assessment process, we also determined that the largest threats to fireflies, at least here in the US, appeared to be habitat loss, light pollution, pesticide use, and then climate change was really coming up as a close fourth. And then, of course, there are other threats that fireflies face, things like declining water quality, invasive species, and even things like poorly managed firefly tourism that can all impact fireflies and their habitats. So what are we doing to mitigate these threats and combat these firefly declines? Like I said, we definitely need more surveys, we need more research, we really need just kind of this like broad effort to collect more data on fireflies, especially those data deficient species. And there are currently several pretty widespread efforts aimed just at that, collecting data, finding out more about where species are distributed. And this includes a program that Xerces launched a couple years ago called the Firefly Atlas, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But there are also a bunch of other ways to help fireflies. And one of these is through the establishment of Firefly Sanctuaries. So this is really an early growing movement to identify and protect important firefly habitats, and then really implement some firefly-friendly management practices while engaging the surrounding communities in the stewardship of the fireflies. Before we get too far along in this, I just want to define how we're using the term firefly sanctuary because I think the word sanctuary can mean a lot of different things. And so for the purposes of this talk and the work that Xerces is doing to promote and support these sanctuaries, we define them as protected areas that are managed specifically to safeguard native wild fireflies and their habitats. There are no governing bodies or certification groups associated with firefly sanctuaries in the US. And so the criteria for what constitutes a sanctuary can vary pretty widely. However, they do seem to include actions such as eliminating artificial light at night, refraining from the use of pesticides, cutting back on mowing practices, and adopting sustainable tourism practices. And another large component of a lot of sanctuaries' missions are also education and outreach, and just raising awareness about fireflies and their needs. So, what are those needs? Let's just take a minute to remember this. So, I've kind of mentioned a few of these throughout the talk, but fireflies really have four main needs, and this includes moisture so that they don't dry out, and so that their prey also don't dry out, those soft-bodied snails, slugs, and worms. They need food in the form of that same prey. They need shelter, and they need dark nights, especially species that are bioluminescent. And so when we keep these needs in mind, and once we start to get to know the species that are present at the sites that you own or manage, you can start to really create a sanctuary that helps fireflies thrive. I'm going to go over some considerations for establishing a firefly sanctuary in a few minutes. But first, I just wanted to share some kind of like case studies or examples of a couple other places that have already gone through this process. And so this first one is actually very close to home, and Aaron mentioned it in his intro, but this is the New Canaan Land Trust Firefly Sanctuary located in New Canaan, Connecticut. And maybe some of you are on the call today who work here or are associated with this land trust. So feel free to pipe in on the questions later. But this land trust was the first, or this Firefly Sanctuary was really the first that we are aware of that was established in the US as, specifically a Firefly Sanctuary. And it was established in 2015, so it's been around for a little while. And it's part of a larger property, and it protects 6.5 acres for fireflies. And so the foremost goal of the sanctuary is really to preserve the land as firefly habitat. But a close second goal that they shared with me is that they want to really share the experience of fireflies with the surrounding community. And so during peak firefly season, which at this site runs from about late June through early July, volunteers will go out and lead guided group walks to the firefly meadow, which you can see in this really pretty picture here. And they've also adopted several other practices to help protect fireflies and their habitat at this site. So I have a list of some of those things here, but it includes no pesticide use, since we know pesticides can harm fireflies and their prey. They've limited their mowing, typically only doing it once a year, and then usually in the winter, and that's really just to help maintain meadow habitat and keep out encroaching trees. They allow fallen trees and branches and leaves to stay on the ground so that this actually creates additional shelter and habitat for fireflies in all of their different life stages, but especially those larval stages, and even for other adults that might be sheltering on the ground. And then also working to reduce light pollution. During the peak activity period, they reach out to adjacent landowners and ask if they can keep their lights off at night. And then as they're doing this, these guided walks during peak season, they also employ a registration system for access to ensure that the site doesn't get overwhelmed with visitors and that habitat does not get destroyed. So hopefully some of you have been to the site. I have not yet, but it seems really amazing. Another example I wanted to share is the Kohler Mountain Bike Preserve Firefly Sanctuary. And this is one of the newest sanctuaries that I'm aware of. It just opened last year, and it's located within kind of this unusual mountain bike preserve in Arkansas. And so the sanctuary is actually a joint project between a nonprofit foundation that owns the preserve and then a group of local master naturalists who came to the preserve and proposed this idea of what if we set aside part of the preserve as a firefly sanctuary. And so their stated goal for the sanctuary is to share the magic of fireflies with others and ensure that that magic lives on for future generations. And so this sanctuary is a lot smaller. It's about 1 acre in size, and it's open to the public year round. Again, the main firefly viewing season is really in June, and that's when they will probably be getting most of their visitors for fireflies. To protect the fireflies, they preserve native plants, they refrain from the use of pesticides, they eliminate artificial lights wherever possible, and they really ensure minimal disturbance to wooded areas. And so similar to the New Canaan site, they also have guided walks for the public during peak season, and these are led by the master naturalists who proposed the sanctuary in the first place. And those master naturalists are also going to the site throughout the season and conducting firefly surveys so that they can learn more about the local population of fireflies and identify what species they're using or what species are there and what habitats they're using throughout the site. Um, this group has been really inspirational because I feel like in just a year they've done a lot. So just in the last few months, I've learned that they've also launched a community science project to learn more about the fireflies of Arkansas. And I think they just put out their kind of beta website for that. And then they've also inspired the creation of at least one additional firefly sanctuary in the state. And I think there are several more that are being talked about right now. So really providing a model for what others can do in the area. I mentioned earlier that there aren't any governing bodies or third-party certifiers for firefly sanctuaries, at least not in the US. That said, there is a firefly habitat certification program, and this was launched by Ben Pfeiffer. He started the Firefly Conservation and Research Organization, which is based in Texas. And he started this habitat certification program several years ago. So participants basically agree to adopting a set of firefly-friendly practices, and then they can buy the sign and post it in their firefly habitat. So I've noticed that a growing number of firefly sanctuaries and other folks, whether it's just like private landowners or city parks or other places, they've started adopting these practices and then opting to sign on and display one of these signs just as their way to share a commitment with others. So as you saw from the New Canaan example, I think land trusts can really help shape and lead this movement to kind of increase the number of firefly sanctuaries across the country. And maybe I'm wrong, but hopefully not. I really think that land trusts are in some ways uniquely positioned to help establish these sanctuaries because you all just seem to, you have a lot of expertise in land preservation, community engagement, habitat restoration. You all seem to have the legal and financial tools that are really necessary to protect a land. And you're often working directly with local communities and landowners. And this can really help raise awareness about fireflies and also involve others. And then you're also just able to implement firefly-friendly management practices that can really help protect fireflies, especially from really specific threats, things like light pollution or pesticide use. So that is part of the reason that we are reaching out to land trusts right now. We really just started that this year, and definitely grateful to Erin for having us here today. So I'm going to go over some steps to consider if you'd like to establish your own firefly sanctuary. And then at the end of this, I'm going to share some additional resources that might be helpful in learning more. And this will include a guide that we put together last year that explains each of these steps in more detail and then kind of has a few more additional steps as well. So maybe this one's obvious, but the very first step you need to take when considering establishing a firefly sanctuary is selecting your location. And perhaps just as obviously, this location should have fireflies. So if you're not sure if you think you have a site that seems really ideal for fireflies, maybe it has a nice big meadow or a really nice riparian area, you might need to do some after dark scouting just to make sure that fireflies are actually there. And if you have several locations to choose from, I would encourage really considering, whether you'd like to focus on one particular site that might have maybe a really robust firefly population, or maybe it has a really unusual or unique habitat type that the fireflies seem to be associated with. So those are just some considerations. And if you don't know what firefly species you have at your site, we have tools to help you figure that out. So really in this early phase, just thinking about the requirements fireflies have. Like, what are those needs for fireflies? Again, dark nights, moisture, shelter, food. And so when you're picking sites to act as a sanctuary for fireflies, ideally that site would have all of those elements. And once you have a location or two in mind, then you can start figuring out what species you have. And I'll be honest, this can take, a season or two, especially if you're new to fireflies and you're just learning about the diversity of fireflies in your area. And so you can start really basically just, download a species checklist for the state. So the Firefly Atlas website that I mentioned earlier, that's a community science program that Xerces runs, and it has an associated website. And so there's a species checklist for the US and Canada there, and you can actually just filter it to your state and download a list. And I checked yesterday, and there are currently 19 species described from the state of Connecticut. And so as you kind of, learn what might exist there and learn more about the different activity periods and habitat associations, you can kind of start to narrow down some potential contenders for your location. Um, there's also a map on the Firefly Atlas website that you can use to see, where are other people reporting fireflies. And then if you're familiar with iNaturalist, that is also a really excellent tool for just getting a sense of what might be nearby, what time of year they're active. And you'll probably want to inventory at least one full season to get to know your resident firefly fauna. And obviously, this just depends on capacity and interest and all of these other factors. But fireflies are interesting because they can really span a really long period of time, both across months in the summer and then also just across time from, say, like the daytime to dusk to past midnight. And some fireflies have really particular niches that they use, and they're only active for like 20 minutes, 2 weeks a year, like at 11 p.m. So really deciding, are you going to go all out and look for fireflies all night long, or are you really just going to try to get a sense of what's happening in the earlier hours of the evening? So it's likely that your site will host just a subset of those 19 species that I mentioned. And just to give you a brief overview, so of those 19 species, 15 of them are flashing species or lightning bugs. And then 4 are those daytime active species that I mentioned that don't light up and they're active during the day. And during our assessment process, most of these we assessed as least concern, which is great news. 2 have not been evaluated yet. And then for the rest of them, there's like 4 flashing species that are considered data deficient, but also of conservation concern. And this is due to documented declines in parts of their range or suspected or known threats to their habitats. And so, truthfully, any one of these species would be good contenders for a firefly sanctuary. It really just depends on your goals. Like, are you wanting to focus on a rare species? Do you want to just help fireflies more broadly? Do you want to work to keep the common species common? So if you want to go beyond general inventory and collect data that can be used by other researchers, you can consider using the protocols and data sheets for the Firefly Atlas. So this is the website I mentioned. And this is both a hub for information and an online portal for submitting and viewing data and species distributions. So we crowdsource occurrence data from the US and Canada, and we're really hoping to learn more about where the species are found, when they're active, what habitats they are using. This is kind of like a level up from just doing an inventory. So maybe year two if year one seems overwhelming. So once you have a site identified and you know it has fireflies, it's time to consider the goals of your sanctuary. And habitat protection and preservation are probably going to be a big part of it. That's a big part of what land trusts do. But then also thinking about things like education and outreach. Is that important to you? Do you want to engage the local community? If you know that the fireflies at your site could be a big draw for visitors, can you promote sustainable and ethical firefly tourism? And again, thinking about that piece, like, are you primarily focused on the protection of a single at-risk or endemic species, or are you hoping to make it broader in scope? So once you have these core details in place, location, species, and your goal and mission, then it's time to put together a site management plan. And this is a really helpful tool. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with them, but they detail actions to be taken at a particular site to effectively manage and conserve wildlife species. So in this case, fireflies. And in the context of a firefly sanctuary, this plan really provides a roadmap for targeted conservation efforts. So really keeping in mind these very specific, unique needs of the firefly species that happen to be at your site. And these plans can be standalone documents, or if you already have an existing management plan, you can kind of fold them in or incorporate them into those. And just keep in mind too that, these plans are definitely the most successful when they include some sort of mechanism for monitoring the effectiveness of actions and then, using that information, adjusting them over time. So really, I think the best management plans are ones that are more like living documents that can be updated as you learn more and more. Regardless of your sanctuary's structure, size, or goals, you will probably need funding to ensure its long-term success. So really consider your goals and your site management plan. And, maybe a lot of these things already align really well with what is already happening at the site. And if so, that's awesome. Maybe this is really simple. It would be great if that was often the case. I'm sure there are other times when that's not going to be the case. And so it's definitely helpful to determine, how much will these proposed management actions cost? And remember, this can include anything from habitat restoration to those firefly inventories. Maybe you have volunteers coming out and you need to coordinate with them. Maybe you need to, maintain some trails or build a boardwalk so that there's less impact on fireflies and their habitats. So just thinking about these things, like where can you find funding and can you phase your plan to make things more attainable? So maybe each year you just do a few of these things and slowly build from there. And then also just think about what community partners you can reach out to for help. So, thinking about like the Kohler Mountain Bike Preserve that I mentioned, the preserve is the kind of the hosting site, but then these master naturalists are the ones who are coming in and doing the talks, doing the surveys, doing some other restoration work on the ground. And then once you have kind of all of these basics in place, then you get to start thinking about additional steps. And these are kind of like cherry on top steps. But really just like how can you engage with your local community? Can you have special firefly events, maybe volunteer days, maybe even engaging them earlier on in the planning process? I love this photo. It's from the master naturalists at Kohler, and one of their members actually made these custom firefly life cycle costumes that they wore for educational events and firefly walks last year. So you can see going from left to right, we have an adult firefly, we have a firefly pupa, a firefly larva, and then a firefly egg. Um, so I think these like local groups can just be really wonderful partners for firefly sanctuaries. And, as you get more established, maybe you can even consider what might be a very big jump, but even establishing things like monitoring programs. or really extensive outreach programs. And then again, just don't forget this piece to continually evaluate and adapt. This was something that was stressed by everyone we interviewed for the guide that I'm going to talk about, and the case studies that we included was just, they had such big learning curves for some of their sites and just constantly, yeah, they just stressed the need to really like assess what was happening and where things were going and how they could change things the following year to make it better. And ideally, this Firefly Sanctuary will be in place for a long time. And so planning that with that in mind is also really helpful for this long-term sustainability. And then because Firefly Sanctuaries are still pretty new concept in the US, and I think there are so many different shapes and forms that they can take. I really encourage you to share what you learn, both with me and Xerces, kind of selfishly, but also with others and other people who might be interested in creating these sanctuaries. Because I think there's a real opportunity to be role models for others who are considering this approach. You know, I am aware of, I think, 5 sanctuaries in the entire country right now. And so we're hoping that this really takes off. But I have already learned a ton just talking with the 4 that we interviewed. And I think it's just a fun thing to share with others and get people engaged with. And everything that you learn is going to be helpful, whether it's negative or positive. I think it's really important to share those lessons. So hopefully this has gotten you a little excited about fireflies and maybe even the potential for creating a sanctuary, or maybe even just starting out by, finding out what fireflies exist at your site and getting to know the local fauna before even considering jumping to this stage. But yeah, hopefully you're excited. I have a few resources I want to share with you. So if you want to read more details about establishing a sanctuary and read more about those case studies that I mentioned, this is the guide that I keep talking about. We developed this last year, just the guide to establishing firefly sanctuaries in the US, and it's on the Firefly Atlas website. And this really expands on some of the steps that I just talked about and provides examples of what some of those things could look like in practice. And you can find a number of other Firefly conservation resources on the Atlas website as well. And there are a bunch pictured here, but some of interest might be, we have fact sheets on things like firefly-friendly lighting practices, protecting fireflies from pesticides. We have some sustainable firefly tourism guidelines. So both for site managers, but then also for people who are visiting the site, we have these little handouts about, visitor etiquette to firefly sites. And then we have several other reports about best management practices and this kind of state of the fireflies that summarizes our assessment process and results. So if you want to see that full species list for Connecticut, or really any other state or province in Canada, you can check out the species checklist. So this little yellow arrow points to where you'll find it. It's just under the species or firefly species in the menu. And yeah, you can just select your area of interest. You can see it circled in red here under distribution. And then you can either download your results into a spreadsheet, or you can click on the links associated with each one and learn more about each of these species. And then the Xerces Firefly team is also here as a resource, so please do not hesitate to reach out to us. We're only a team of 2 right now, but we try really hard to respond to everyone who reaches out. So depending on the situation and the time of year, it's possible we can help you with different things related to fireflies. And this could be things like planning or sometimes even conducting those species inventories or surveys. We can help with species ID. We can work with you on a site management plan or other guidance. So really, if you're curious, if you want to know more, if you want to work together, feel free to just email us. And if you email this address in particular, fireflyatlas@xerces.org. Those will go to both me and my co-worker, Richard Joyce, who is pictured here. With that, I just want to thank all of Xerces supporters, including Band, who funds this work and this webinar and the guide that we created. But I'd especially like to just say thank you to all of you for joining us today. And like I said, please reach out. Please check out our website. I'm happy to take any questions. And I'll end this here.
Thank you so much, Candace. That was fantastic. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. Maybe we can start with that. We've got about 15 minutes left in our webinar. And as we're going through these, if folks have other questions, definitely feel free to put those into the chat, or if you want to raise your hand and come on camera, we can do that as well. But just working through some of the questions. Are firefly inventories only done when, or only of the adult phase, or do you inventory the larval and pupal stages as well? And can you describe a typical set of inventory practices if a land trust wanted to implement those?
Yeah, great question. So most Firefly inventories or surveys are focused on the adults. There are some exceptions. So with the glowworm fireflies that I mentioned, most most male adult glowworms are non-luminescent, and so it's really hard to see them. And the females do glow, but they're very tiny and they're on the ground, and that can be really tricky. And so, um, well, yeah, maybe that's a bad example, especially because you all don't have glowworms. But I will say, yes, sometimes larval firefly surveys are conducted. Sometimes the larvae do amass on the ground, and depending on the genus that the firefly is in, some stay subsurface, but some do come to the surface level. And depending on the species, that can be a good way to survey. But yeah, by and large, they're focused on the adults. And a typical night out doing a firefly survey, I will admit it is challenging to do surveys at night. And fireflies, I think part of the reason people haven't done a lot of monitoring work with them is because, you're working in the dark and there's all of the things that, nighttime work can bring, like a whole new suite of wildlife species to contend with. And um, yeah, it's just harder to work in the dark. But you basically go out, we have these data sheets that we provide, and you are basically trying to look at a site and say, like, okay, I see a flash. Can I basically like trace that flash to an individual firefly? Is it possible to catch that firefly, get it in hand, take photos, and then hopefully ID it later? But we're really looking for like a group of clues in order to do these IDs. And so not only will you hopefully catch that species, but before you do, you will record its flash pattern because each species has a specific flash pattern that it uses. So you record the flash pattern, you describe what it looks like, how long it is, if there are different spaces between the flashes time-wise, and then yeah, take a photo of your species. If you can get a rough count of how many there are at a site, which can be hard, do that. Um, yeah, there's a lot more information, goes in a lot more in depth on the website, and I'm happy to chat more about that too.
Awesome, thank you. And we can definitely follow up with those survey sheets as well if folks are interested. Um, Somebody just wanted to know the number of listed species and total number of species that are found in North America for fireflies.
So the total number, we have 177 described species and two subspecies. And then for listed, I'm not sure if you mean like federally listed. We currently don't have any federally listed species, except there is one that was proposed to be listed by Fish and Wildlife last year, I think in either October or November. And we're still waiting for the kind of final listing on that. Um, so if listed, it would be the first firefly in the US to be considered threatened under the Endangered Species Act. There are two more that are currently being considered for listing. And then there are an additional two that have been petitioned but have not yet received a 90-day decision, like notice decision. And so we're just still waiting on that to see if the service thinks that it might be warranted.
Great. Well, those are all the questions in the chat thus far. If anybody has additional questions, feel free to come on camera, raise your hand, or add those to the chat as well. Maybe in the meantime, I have one question. It seems that there's a healthy overlap in sort of the Venn diagram between firefly habitat and just useful habitat for other critters and pollinators, like whether it's bees, butterflies, you name it. Is there anything about managing for firefly habitat that might make, I don't know, that maybe makes that given site a little bit less favorable for some of the pollinators that might also benefit with it, or is it really just a everybody wins kind of situation?
I think in a lot of cases it might be an everybody wins. I mean, like all, basically all other wildlife, fireflies are wild species that want wild natural areas to exist in. I think the piece that sets them apart from at least some other pollinators, not all of them, there are nocturnal pollinators, but like that light pollution piece and really managing for darkness is an important one. But I think when we talk about like more large scale restoration projects for pollinators, really considering how those activities might impact fireflies from anything like trampling of the larvae or, flightless females to just kind of like changing the structure of their habitat. And, a lot of pollinators, again, there are exceptions, but a lot of pollinators like these like open meadow spaces, like they like sun, they like flowers. And while some firefly species also seem to like those types of places, there are a lot of species that are associated with like forests and, these like deeply forested riparian areas. They're associated with salt marshes. They're associated with these like dry desert canyons that have little pockets of, water here and there. And so, yeah, I think just considering that, I feel like a lot of pollinator habitat, like restoration and protection work focuses on like floral resources, and that's just not going to be the case with fireflies. Like you really need to think about other things as well.
Perfect. One more question that came in. Will a cornfield adjacent to a possible site have a negative impact on fireflies? Um, I'm wondering if this person is perhaps referring to any pesticides or herbicides that might be applied in that situation, or runoff, or um, yeah, just adjacent impacts, and maybe also thinking about like the buffer that firefly sanctuaries need, if any.
Yeah, a buffer is a great idea if that's possible. It really depends on how the like ag field is managed. So yeah, if it's a conventional, cornfield that has a lot of pesticides applied, that could definitely have negative implications for fireflies and their habitats. There isn't a ton of research specifically on pesticide impacts to fireflies to date, but we have some studies that show that like neonicotinoids, which are hugely used in agriculture, have really detrimental effects on firefly populations. Um, so that's definitely a concern. And yeah, the exposure to pesticides can happen whether it's just drifting from one site into the natural area and hitting flying adult fireflies, or if there's runoff in the water, especially from like pesticide treated seeds even like going through the water or through the soil. So yeah, those could definitely, it's definitely something to consider, kind of that like larger landscape and the matrix that you're situated in.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, thank you. I think that's all the questions we have. Going once, going twice. If anybody has one more. We're getting a lot of thanks in the chat, so I'll echo that. Candace, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. We will be following up with the recording and with slides and some of the other resources that Candace shared today. Um, if there are any questions, Candace, if you can, maybe we can get your email address and send folks your way. But again, thank you and thank everybody for joining us today, and look forward to seeing some fireflies this summer.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you coming.